Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is there a market for truth? In this question, I'm primarily interested in journalism. I suppose what's prompted this is just general news stories that come out about a whole host of different items, and you're like, well, is that actually true or not? And whether or not people actually want truthful information is really what I kind of got to be thinking about. Because if people, assuming that the journalists and newspapers traditionally and news networks are pure profit maximizers in sort of like the classic economic sense, then they'll produce things that consumers want to buy. And if they don't want to buy truthful information, then, well, they're not going to supply it. So I thought this would be an interesting thing to go down. So when you talk about the news, I kind of distinguish between a few different types of news, sort of weather-related, politics, celebrities, entertainment, sports, finance, and crime. Those are generally the types of news story that you get. There's broader, there are things that don't necessarily fit there, but those I think are quite useful. So let's start with the weather. I think people actually want to know what the weather is going to be like. I think people have a genuine interest in that. Now, of course, you have got the people who always want to have climate catastrophism. So there is that element, and to the extent that people might want that, and again, here I'm for both the moment here, just assuming sort of almost directly a consumer-led production. But the weather people want to know, they want to know whether it's going to be worthwhile them going out to the park, if it's going to rain and whatever. That's likely to be something used to them. And also stories about whether it's the hottest day or the coldest day. I mean, again, sensationalism might pay a bit there, but people are generally interested. Is it colder or is it hotter than it was before? Fine. The thing is, though, beyond there, to me, maybe finance news, maybe people want to know what's true when it comes to finance, insofar as it helps their own investment, their investment plan. So, if you want to buy Tesla stocks, or you want to buy Amazon, or you want to buy gold or crypto, you want to have a good idea of what's going to happen to it in the future. And so, to that extent, that's kind of nice to know and helpful for investment purposes. And people are generally interested if firms are doing badly or doing well financially. If it's stores that people are familiar with, like in the UK when Debenhams went under or Toys R Us went under, again, of their general financial position, there's a market to know what's truthful about them. Although, of course, it's always useful to know things that are not true. But it's always worth for some people to lie, because then they can make money on it to say, oh, company's doing badly, and then everyone sells and they buy them and they go, oh, no, actually, they're doing better than we thought. So there's clearly that. But I mean, there are still a substantial amount of people who are interested in genuinely truthful information about those. That said, outside of there, it doesn't seem to be obviously the case. So let's take celebrity news, for instance. People just have their people they like, people they don't like. And if you just feed them sort of like low-grade stories, and by story I mean in the sense of, well, if you were producing like a TV show, film, or a book, or a novel, or whatever, it doesn't particularly matter if it's true necessarily. It's just whether it's entertaining or not, and if it makes somebody they don't like look bad. Similar things happens with sports. There are people who are interested in genuine sporting analysis, but a lot of it is, and sporting stuff is manufactured conflict, because people like conflict and disagreement, even though it isn't actually very interesting or actually provides much information as to why a certain team is doing better than another. And again, it goes kind of tribal that way. again, that's obviously true in politics as well. And again, same general and weird entertainment stories. Again, you could just make them up. I mean, the exploits of Florida Man could well be true, but if you just made it up, no one would really know if it wasn't true, because well, it's Florida Man, and that's what you'd expect, and it's entertaining, so I'll read it. Similar things with crime. I mean, you can try and make something look significantly more lurid and sinister than it actually was, because well, people like to read about that. So there does seem to be a great number of people who don't care too much when it comes to what they read. Now, you might say everything else being equal, yeah, I want truthful stuff, but when they actually go into buying things or reading things, they're going to read the things that are probably entertaining or make them feel good. Now, that said, there are clearly a lot of people who care about what actually took place. I mean, a good example would be all the amateur people looking into, for instance, whether Jeffrey Epstein did in fact commit suicide or not. And there's a whole host of, say, YouTube channels which are devoted to sort of analysis. You know, why does the Ukraine war start? What's the background to this? What are all the relevant facts? And it seems to me that there is a market for that kind of analysis. And people provide it for free because they find that it's interesting to provide. Obviously, you get Patreon support and things, but there do seem to be sort of nerd types who are perfectly happy to spend ages looking and reading over a vast quantity of data and then providing analysis for people to look at to see why things have happened and how we can properly interpret this. The big problem, though, seems to be when it comes to, say, Jeffrey Epstein, for instance, if he did or did not commit suicide, is anybody who's actually able to go down there and actually get the information of, well, what actually happened, how was he found, and whatever. Now, clearly, in that case, you're probably going to have to go via the police, which, of course, is a problem. But it seems to be that the expense here is likely to be manpower on the ground. And that's where kind of journalism or truthfulness could well be very expensive to provide. People have argued that online sort of free news has harmed the truthfulness of the newspapers or media types because, well, they rely on ad revenue now, and that means that they have to just get clickbait, which to some extent is true. But according to Pew Research, ever since the 1960s, newspapers, for instance, got far more from advertising they did than the amount that they charged for their papers. And this was especially so when they had massive advertising revenues, and the divergence was biggest in sort of the early 2000s, late 1990s. So that seems to have meant that, well, maybe they needed to produce clickbaity stories back then so that they actually would read the paper and then read the ad. And then, of course, you have the problem as well is, well, if this kind of journalism expensive is funded and needs to be funded basically by advertising, you then have the problem of, well, if the advertisers don't like what you're providing, are they going to pay for you? So this is an obvious thing that's come up with, I think, with a lot of news stations in America when it came to vaccine stuff, because a lot of the advertisers were pharmaceutical companies. You have a weird situation in the UK. I am told that that the foreign press reports that Prince William is having an affair with some minor aristocrat, but nobody in the UK will report it. Now, that's not necessarily to do with advertising, but it could be to do with deep state involvement or whatever, or the influence of the royal family. As to what hold they might have is another question. But you do have the problem of, again, with this kind of thing is you see reviews online, which you could say is a form of journalism. It is. I mean, you have the review journalists. And then it's like you have back payments and you're saying this is good because you've been paid. So there's a whole myriad of problems and issues which may or may not have been made better or worse by technological progress, in particular the internet. So I suppose from that long preamble, Tim, is well, do you think there is a market for truth? Do people care about, or do a substantial amount of people care about the truth of journalistic reporting? Do they think it's
Do people
important
care
in
about
certain
it?
areas, not in other areas?
Um,
What would be your sort of
I don't know.
opening thoughts on
I
that
guess there's a question of
angle?
can people care about it? Like, is there if there isn't a? I guess they're related in the sense that if there's not a if there isn't a quote unquote trustworthy news, why bother? Why bother reading it to begin with? I guess if you ask me my own position on the news, that would be my position. I read zerohedge.com, which is almost daily, which is a compiler of various other random websites, which also compiles it, which in turn compiles it from other sources. Whether Zero Hedge is slightly controlled or not is a good question. It's gotten pretty big recently because I see all sorts of people who I wouldn't suspect posting Zero Hedge. So Zero Hedge is probably my source for quote unquote news, although I'm not sure how controlled or not controlled that is to begin with. The people who accuse Alex Jones of being moderately controlled, I always scratch my head and think that could be the case, but if it is the case, then what can we actually know? Some people like the Todd Lewis a while back interviewed Caleb Malpin, who has a book on BreadTube. BreadTube is oftentimes considered organic, but the people who in BreadTube, but you could argue they're astroturfed, quote unquote, media analysts too. So these are some. I'm not even talking about CNN or Fox News right now. I'm just talking about sites that the quote unquote normies would dismiss as conspiratorial or fringe, and even them they might not necessarily have be the case. Michael Tracy had an interview with Thaddeus Russell about some of the critics of the Ukraine war. And I mean, it is the case that Jackson Hinkle and some of these other types are not only Russia files, they could, in theory, I mean, it could be the case that they are indirectly getting money from Russia. Like that's not, again, I'm not saying the United States or Britain or France doesn't do this. Of course it does. It does it on a scale that's like 10 times as much. I think that's what one of the things Putin said in his Tucker Carlson interview. That's patently obvious that the United States is very good at, in Britain and all the Western powers are very good at, like these sort of soft, covert, not so covert information warfare. So if people do want to care, where can they go? And if there's no place to go that's good, then you might not be able to care. That's roughly my own position regarding the news. I mean, when I was growing up, we got a local newspaper, but eventually this local newspaper was bought out by a conglomerate, which in turn was bought out by another conglomerate. So now I used to basically call it New York Times. I won't say my county name, but I would New York Times blank. And during COVID, they would just run more or less Washington Post or New York Times or AP articles that you could find on MSN or wherever. So in that regard, the quote unquote local newspaper isn't so local. It has a few local articles, but then it has the front page is full of the same dumb op-eds written by the same, you know, center left or center right places. So again, if you're going to turn to your local newspaper, you got to sort of like who runs it. So actually, funny enough, in my own county, local news started, which again, if anyone would think it's like this is like on the Zero Hedge or Infowars.com level thing. It does report local news and does report some national news, but that would be one way to do it. So like who to quote funds it and so forth. I do think there's a problem. I think that the postmodernists actually get this entirely correct. Sorry to say to the critics of the postmodernists, which includes some people on the right, is I don't think there is like any incentive to have like. First of all, I don't think Walter Cronkite. It's like the myth of Walter Cronkite. First of all, that's the point number one. He wasn't telling the news. There isn't such thing as the one source for news. There's like lots of different angles on a story and so forth. Whether that undermines the truth itself by saying that is a good question here. I mean, if you look at historical conflicts 100 years ago, you can read a fairly mainstream book by Neil Ferguson entitled "Pity of War" about World War One. It's quite good at like dismantling basically all the purported stuff that was said in the press. I had it in college. I did a paper on World War One newspaper coverage, and like it was basically all like I think I read through one U.S. paper, two British papers, because that was they had all the back catalogs. I forget what it was, but like I mean, there's just lots of propaganda there. It's not, and this is in a quote unquote free country. We had an episode with terminal philosophy. I mean, you can criticize the United States, Britain, and some of these other Western powers, and for imprisoning Julian Assange and so forth. But I do think there is something of a difference between the United States and like Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. Although maybe there isn't. Maybe it's actually even worse. Who knows? So is there like can you actually know? Is there such thing as a true news? I mean, maybe for a car crash there is. You do, but that's kind of like pointless. A fire story, unless it's like I mean, a lot of news is just kind of pointless. I mean, so I don't really read. I mean, I read Zero Hedge, but like other than that, I don't really follow the news that much. Swithin, what would you make about my first comments? I would say no in the sense that there is no market. There isn't really a market. Maybe finding things about the opposition. Like if you're a political party and you want to like go after, I don't know, if Nikki Haley is trying to run for president, she might want to dig up dirt on the Trumps, or if you're like John McCain, you want to go after Barack Obama, there might be a incentive, but like uh, in general, I'm suspicious.
Well, I suppose my
Postmodernistic,
question,
maybe.
if I rephrase it, would be assuming that you can have broadly truthful news. And when I mean broadly truthful news, what I'm meaning is you're recording what happened, and or you might be recording accurately a statement by somebody. So, for instance, the argument. So, as I understand it, the argument as to why increased glo- increased global average temperatures causes sea level rise is actually because it causes the melting of ice on land. But it's never actually described in that way by any mainstream news media that I've ever come across. They may well do. But my understanding is that's actually the argument, because if you have melting ice in water, then the sea level will go down. So what matters is ice melting on land and going into the sea, because ice is more dense than water, and so it takes up more. Is it more dense? It takes up more. No, it flows. It takes up more space when it goes. It expands. It's probably the easiest way of looking at it. So what I'm saying is that I haven't really ever come across them described that way. So I suppose my question is, do you think there is a particular market? So I suppose the question is this: do people go to the news for entertainment, or do they go there to genuinely learn things about the world? Obviously, there'll be both, but do you think that a substantial number of people are, as I indicated to begin with, probably want to go there just to reinforce what they already believed, make themselves feel good about themselves, and or get entertainment rather than learning things about the world? Would you think that's an accurate representation of the state of affairs, or am I being unfair?
I'm not sure. I I can only speak for myself. I don't guess the motives of others, but I do think one of the problems is this. Nassim Taleb, who I'm more critical of than I was 10 years ago or 8 years ago when I started. COVID made me much more critical of Nassim Taleb, but Nassim Taleb would make the point that like the news is not Gaussian. It's non-Gaussian. It's like some days there's nothing. And I think Lenin has the exact quote like there are weeks that decades happen, and there's decades where nothing happens. Um, So I mean, I think that's one issue with the news is that like in order to keep it in business, you have to have it has to come out every day or every week or every 6 p.m. But there isn't. There's a lot of days where nothing happens. So in that regard, um, there's just that's one problem with the news. Like, and a lot of news stories I just think are kind of pointless. Like, like, would you be okay if you didn't know about it? Like, there was a gas explosion recently. It closed the road in my area, but I wasn't even close to the area. It didn't really affect me. I don't generally drive there, and if I did, I would have just followed Google Maps or the road closure sign would have said it anyway. So it wouldn't really affect me. So it's like, what's the point of learning about this happening? I mean, there's live traffic data that certain apps produce, which that could be useful if you're driving. But if you're not going anywhere, why bother? I mean, learning about it. I did some aviation years past, and like there again, but that kind of weather is very like, as Nassim Taleb, to go back to him again, is very like it's almost it's hyper practical, and actually they get it basically like the professional pilots get it basically as a weather report, not as a there's no attractive woman acting it out in front of a green screen like uh, there's not like there's no it's not acted to you, it's basically just like data. It's just the cloud cover is da da da, the pressure is da 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 da, and so forth. It's not so it's purely like useful information in that sense. It's not in that regard, it's not entertainment at all. But most people aren't in that situation. Regarding like if you go to the park and it starts to rain, you can just go home or go under a cover, and there is some error on that regarding there. But as far as political news, I think we have to go back to our "Is voting a waste of time" episode. I mean, the premise of news in like liberal democratic republics is you read the news to inform yourself about the goings on so you can vote better. I think that's like the official justification of why you should be an informed citizen. We are both right wing anarchists or anarchic libertarians or something like that. Conservative anarchists, conservative libertarians describe us many different ways. I mean, we're both suspicious of voting. So, like, one reason people could learn about, they want to follow, what political candidates do and so forth. But I read Whitney Webb's book about, the Epsteins. It's very detailed. Um, uh, I'd read it somewhat as entertainment, I guess, in a sense that it's like it's useful to know. It's useful to win arguments against people, like know all these random facts. Um, but even there, like on some level, it's like a hobby for me. So I mean, I think I had going back to the voting episode. Is it better to do something? Or I think we did an episode on sports. Like, I'll follow sports news too, but then again, it doesn't really like sports don't really directly affect me in this. Well, maybe they do, but like if I know the team I follow is going to make a trade, that's kind of cool. But like I could have just heard it on the day of, or eventually I'd hear about it when I watch the game or something like that, or a free agent signing. But again, it doesn't really have any direct use for me. So like if you're skeptical of voting, then the purpose of reading news, like what would you say is the purpose of going out and finding about the news, other than like if you don't have an instrument rating and you can't fly in clouds, you have to see if there's cloud cover, like that kind of like is purely practical. But or like but we're not, most of us aren't pilots or sailors or flying kites or paragliders. Those type of things, that's useful. But like what would you say the purpose of news? I mean, I assume you don't think the purpose of news is to better inform your choice about the next election. But like if you ask official people, like this is civics 101, that would be the reason. Swithin?
Oh yeah, you're 100% right with that. Um, I mean, so why would people, or why would watch news? I say I think a lot of people read the news as a form of entertainment. to a large extent, as politics is middle class wrestling, uh, for one thing. Um, I mean, I think people like celebrity news because if you like the films of somebody or you see what they do, they're kind of almost like a friend, and therefore you're interested in what your friends do. Therefore, you're interested in what they do, which, insofar as you are a huge fan of somebody, kind of makes sense. Whether you should be a huge fan of them is another question, but it makes some sort of sense. And then people read like, and I suppose things like crime. Oh, oh, this serial killer had like 20 women in the freezer or something. It's like, well, people like that. I mean, that just appears in stories and people find entertaining. And you got all these old magazine dedicated historical murders and things. So um, you are right. News is Gaussian because people are interested in the unusual stuff. I suppose when it comes to why, I mean, I barely watch news at all. I have very little interest in it because I don't find many of it particularly interesting. I don't think I'm going to learn anything new, particularly about anything. If I do that, I find a book. Now, then the question is, are the books truthful? That's another question, and whether they have the motivation to do so, or whether they themselves want to be sort of clickbaity and trying to get people to sort of watch the news. I mean, I suppose I maybe didn't bring out as much as I could have done before. I would think that there's a distinction when it comes to news between analysis and sort of pure reporting, and you get both when it comes to quote unquote the news. And I think when it comes to analysis, I think there are quite a lot of channels of people who at least seem to care about what happens or why, say, the Ukraine war started. Why did World War? I mean, it's more historical. I suppose it's history. But to be fair, history is just sort of current events in the past, if that makes sense. You still need the kind of data points. Whether you interpret them differently is another question, which of course you could do. But I mean, the fact that, say, JFK got shot, kind of, unless we want to go global skepticism, I don't think anyone's really going to claim that JFK wasn't shot and killed. The question is well, who and how? But as I say, I think there's a lot of people who are sort of dedicated to putting out what they. Or I put it this way: I think there are a lot of people who do analysis, who basically do it for free, basically on YouTube or other online platforms, who at least they would style themselves and they look like they're people who care about putting what they believe to be truthful information out there, and they actually change. This is probably the main reason for this. Whereas that doesn't seem to be the case with mainstream news outlets. The best example I can think of here is the good old George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin case, where they deliberately, where they played the, or was it MSNBC? They played the call where the policeman was asking Zimmerman, "Oh, what was the problem?" Whatever, and then the guy on the phone says, "What's his race or ethnicity?" And Zimmerman says he's black, and MSNBC cut out the part at which the policeman asks him what the ethnic group was to make Zimmerman look like some evil white racist. That clearly is not a decision made by an organization who cares about the truthfulness of the news. Actually, there's another. I think I mentioned this before. I mean, when it comes to news, there's a very interesting. Well, I think it's a very good film called Nightcrawler, and there it goes bizarre. It almost end up they create the news so they can report on it, which is kind of an interesting angle on it. I wouldn't say much more about it because it's an interesting film. But yeah. Would you agree with me? Do you think that there are people who go out of their way, analysis-wise, to sort of say what they think is true and are sort of seemingly honest in the way they present things, in the way that news media might not?
Are there? So your question is: are there people out there who go? Are there commentators out there that go out of the way just to report the quote unquote truth? Is that your question?
No, no, no. I'm talking about analysis. We need to get to reporting in a second, but on analysis. So as I say, I think you can split the news into sort of reporting and analysis, and it seems to me that there are people who care about who do based on the facts that they're available, which are probably ultimately have either been picked up by historians going through archives or are news reports of stuff that's happened. What I'm asking is, would you agree with me that there are people who are sort of honest investigators in trying to say, well, I think this happened for this reason? Do they seem to exist in your view?
I think I think they probably exist. I think people, at least in good faith, try to do that. I just don't know. I just don't know how. I just don't know how you can divorce. I guess I'm too much of a right wing postmodernist to buy into this sort of generic version of these generic version of the truth. Like even like Kennedy. Like if you want to say, if you go back to your example of the Kennedy was killed. Okay, that's there's you start with that statement, but that's like a boring statement. The question is who killed Kennedy, and then
No, well, hang on, no. The fact that he was killed was interesting at the time.
yes,
I mean, not now. It's like, oh yeah, of course he's dead. He died ages ago. Everyone knows that. But at the time, the fact that it happened was at least interesting.
yes. But Taleb's right. That requires that you can get the headline. I mean, the next question is who shot Kennedy. It's not the question of and why they shot Kennedy. So in that regard, it's hard to like 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 even to go back to 9/11, like there's a more local event which probably will start looking like the Kennedys too. Like you can say, well, the buildings fell. Well, even there, like if you ask some people, Glenn Greenwald's on an interview with Tim Dillon, and he didn't answer this question directly, but he answered it with a parable, basically, very like Jesus like thing to do. But he started talking about the Vietnam War, but like even there, you say, well, the buildings fell because the planes hit it. Well, if you ask the conspiracy theory, even that simple fact is false. They would argue they're imploded or something like that. So if you ask the conspiracy theory, they are that there wasn't just like a bare fact there. I mean, you could say, well, something happened in New York City on September 11th. You can make it. You can make it sufficiently abstract. You might say there's a fact there. But even to simply describe it, I guess you could. I'm not trying to be overly obtuse here. I just I I'm just I'm very suspicious of normie conservatives and normie liberals who say, today with the internet, now everyone doesn't believe anything. But in the 1980s, when it was just Walter Cronkite, and then you could trust the news. That's false. That's
Oh
false.
no, no,
Um,
no, 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 no. That's clearly,
I
obviously
know you're
false,
not
and I,
saying that, but
and please,
I know you're not saying that. I just
that's
don't.
not what. Oh yeah, they're really annoying. But that's why I was pointing out earlier about how advertising revenue is so important. I mean, everyone goes, oh, it's all clickbait today, but the ad revenue was important in the 90s and in the 80s. It was really important. So why would they say something that their advertisers disliked? Why is a corporation going to advertise in a newspaper that's going to say how bad the corporation is because they've been putting toxic waste into the water supply?
If anything,
I mean,
thanks
that
to
doesn't.
the internet and Patreon, like the incentives are actually like as long as there's 1,000 people who's willing to promote $1, you can $1 a month. That person could at least survive to do the reporting. So if anything, I would say the incentives thanks to the internet are better than they were in the past. But the reach, I think this is something that people talk about. Like you can be platform, but you can't have reach. Like some people might not like the quote unquote truth about the Epstein's or whatever or Vietnam or Ukraine war. Like it might be out there, but most people aren't. It's not going to be reported in a mainstream paper. It's going to be reported on some website that's running like Linux or WordPress that has bad Flash or something like that, like or some or some like a 4chan or something like that. So I would say reach might be the way that the truth is limited today more so than there. But I but would you agree with me on my point about there isn't such thing as a quote unquote bare fact? Like maybe, okay, maybe if you make it sufficiently abstract,
It,
maybe.
it, it's difficult. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're always going to have to choose what to include. And in certain events, it can be more difficult. I mean, even with the planes, you get the good old no plane theorists when it comes to 9/11. So I agree, but I suppose just on a pragmatic level, all I'm saying is, well, if you were a reporter who cared about the truthfulness of what happened, and they were just trying to report what happened, then they would probably include it. I suppose in such a report that might include, well, we think this might happen, but somebody else doesn't think happens. But and to cover the bases, you could do that. I mean, that would be a reasonable way of going about it. And I think that would be possible. Because I think when it comes to disagreements, I think, in, well, I suppose you could always think of a different thing to disagree about. But I mean, there's generally a terrain of debate that, well, okay, there's this people here and this people there. So, like with estimates of deaths of certain things, according to, like, I don't know, Stalin, it's like, well, I suppose it depends what you want to attribute him. I suppose you could say the minimum is the ones he killed personally, if he did in fact kill anybody, and then all the ones that are directly responsible for his policies. Um, we could go that way. Um, but so yeah, I wouldn't say there's bad, but there's clearly stage situations where you're going in for proper kind of analysis to try to explain why things have happened, even though they're in a more sort of systematic way, whereas sort of just putting facts in because they seem relevant is kind of different. I would say, and I think it's interesting on Patreon. I mean, the independent sort of news type guys I've seen on Patreon, oh sorry, seen on like YouTube, um, they seem to don't tend to just do reporting. They tend to be analysts. I mean, Michael Tracy did seem to go about and do some on the ground journalism. He at least went to. He got power patted by, was it Modi multiple times? I think when he was talking to uh, that guy. I can't remember his name.
Thaddeus Russell.
Alice Russell, yeah. Um, so he does seem to do some sort of direct journalism, but I mean, like Tim Pool, I've never really known him do anything other than just analyze things that have been around in the news media. So I do think Patreon could do that. I just not sure whether somebody who just brought facts, well, let's say substantially unembellished stuff would be that interesting, I suppose, and therefore get a Patreon following. I suppose
I'm not really sure. Not to be abstract, I'm not really sure what journalists do. Okay, so like I'll start with something that's very simple. Sports journalists. One of the problems that a lot of like I find the mainstream sports journalists. I watch a lot of baseball. Off and on, I watch a lot of baseball. But I find the mainstream sports journalists who attend the games be kind of boring. I find the bloggers who just watch the game on TV like me to be much more interesting. So it's like, why do you have to be there to know about the thing in itself? Like, and the players themselves never, like, the players are all coached to answer the media with, oh, he's a great teammate, doing it for the team, worked hard, best shape of my life, in the gym. They just say the same quotes. Yeah, and like anytime they do the after, if they win a close game, they have player interviews, and like I'll put like there's a thing about I think Ryan Long did it about how the media picks headlines. There's a guy with a blindfold throwing a dart at a wall. In the same way, like the every once in a while, an athlete will say something incendiary about the teammate, but then generally they'll apologize a day later. But you know, you don't like. Do you have to actually be at the sports game to know it happened or didn't happen? I guess if you want to take pictures, sure, but unless there's a direct conspiracy, you can just watch it on TV. And I'm of the position that unless you're paying a lot for your seats, and even if you pay good seats, you can actually see games better on TV. Again, now I know people might view me as a boring bourgeois dud for watching sports games, but like an example, like Ukraine war. I'm not really sure how you can report on the Ukraine war. Like it's like the front is about the size of like 400 miles. I think from Odessa all the way up. There's parts in Kiev, and there's also stories that are happening in Paris, Washington, Brussels. Negotiations are happening. I mean, you get people like Max Blumenthal and like Prime Time. Oh, I forget his name, but they'll go to like the Bilderberg group and try to like ambush, dignitaries there. They'll try to like, they'll try to go in there like that. That's journalism. But normies don't view that as journalists. Nor like all the Washington press correspondents are basically, for the most part, sycophants or like just. And I don't know what they're looking for when they bring up the press advisor at the White House press advisor. I mean, they're just basically a PR person. I mean, they make good skits for people to make fun of on Twitter or formerly SNL when it's a Republican. But other than that, I don't really know. Like, I don't really know what you're gonna get from following around. You know, like even if you followed around like a U.S. senator, like I don't really know what you're gonna get in that regard. So I'm just somewhat suspicious of what quote unquote journalists do. Like Julian Assange. This is what goes back to the problem with Julian Assange here. Like it is true that Julian Assange is kind of like doesn't like the American military-industrial complex. He does have an axe to grind. I don't care, but like he is an activist. He's not like he's and same way with Daniel Ellsberg. He was in the military industrial complex. He didn't go to school to become a journalist. He was in the actual agency. So like in those guys, but they didn't go out and start it. I mean, you get soldiers' accounts of news. So I guess journalists can facilitate people. Um, but like Glenn Greenwald is like kind of a one of a kind person. And even today, Glenn Greenwald doesn't do journalism anymore. He just does commentary. He had like a handful of stories he broke in his career, which made him big. Same way with like someone like Chris Hedge or the guy who reported on the bridge being blown up by the Americans, Seymour Hersh. But he'll report like one story every few years. One big story. Goes back to the Nassim Taleb point regarding news. So I'm just suspicious of what journalists do. And like local journalists who report car crashes and fires. I mean, I'm of the sort of philosophical position that like it doesn't they're basically strangers. I mean, I don't really see like what the point of knowing about a car crash on a local highway or or I mean, unless of course like it was a CIA plant to kill somebody, like, but that's not going to be reported by the local reporter anyway. So I'm just suspicious of what reporters do outside of like sports games and car crash stories. Would you agree with that regarding my analysis regarding reporters with them?
I, I, yeah, I do think that to a large extent is true. I think that what happens with a lot of actual news is it's just effectively um, commentary on government press releases, and why you end up with sycophantic individuals is because you're just waiting for leaks. And if you're nice to them, they'll give you stories which you can run before everybody else, and you get a pay rise. That seems to be the way it works like that. So yeah, I mean, I suppose the question is, what is there to find out? And I think potentially as well with like social media, in a way, I mean, whether even on the boots on the ground journalism actually is necessary, is I mean, because you could just have people with like an AI algorithm going through Twitter to figure out what people have reported. It's like, oh, the thing is, how do journalists know to go anywhere? It's like, well, someone told them that something happened. Oh, we'll go and look. But if people have just sort of recorded it, well, then why do you even need to be there? I mean, you can use that base footage. Now, clearly the camera work and thing could be misleading, obviously, and insofar as you've got multiple camera angles, that might be quite nice. But beyond there, I mean, maybe they go and I don't know. It might be the case the police will talk to journalists, but they won't talk to randos online. That might be one of the main things, and again, that's one reason why they'll treat certain the police well, because the police will give them information about stories which they can they can provide. So maybe the sort of the difficulties of on the boots on the ground stuff, basic reporting doesn't actually need to be done anymore, because you're right when it comes to sports. I mean, sports journalism is terribly dull, and if you've got like highlights of the game, why do you even need to read a report? I mean, it makes sense if you can't see the highlights, but you can now, so why do you need to? The only interesting stuff is, I think, is like tactical analysis and stuff. And some journalists do that well. There are some good, like, there are some good sort of like, well, I know football more than I know baseball. And by that, I mean actual football, not American football. And YouTubers and stuff. So I think, maybe it's possible that, contrary to what a lot of people think, that actually social media and having recording devices everywhere is actually going to liberate the news, liberate the quote unquote the news, because all that basic boring journalist on the boots on the ground stuff doesn't need to be done anymore, because you can just access it online. Now, clearly, whether it happened or not, I mean, people can make stuff up easily. You might need to chase up and try to figure out whether it's true or not. But you could sift through the information online and then maybe message them or something. Obviously, you've got a problem with bots and stuff. You have to identify that, but maybe that's a way of going, because I mean, the sports one is a good one. Though, insofar as you've got recordings of it, why do you need anyone to report on it? I mean, what purpose would it serve? So, Tim, what do you reckon? Do you reckon sort of social media posts could be sort of the salvation of the news, or am I too optimistic?
I think you're too. I think that's too optimistic. But I do think the news is in some ways better than it was. Again, not to sound like a Pollyanna or a Panglossian here, or like a techno optimist here necessarily. Although you might indirectly accuse me of that. I do think in that regard things are better now than they were 100 years ago, ceteris paribus, regarding the quote-unquote news. Like, people didn't even know FDR. Again, most people didn't even know FDR was handicapped, for example. Now, again, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, is also handicapped, too. Or whatever politically correct term you want to use, FYI. In a wheelchair. LOL. But, like, that's just a simple thing that people just didn't know. Now, is that relevant information? I don't know. But there are also other things, like I was recently in New Mexico, and we went to the Los Alamos site. Again, there is a conspiracy regarding nuclear weapons, which I recently heard about. But people didn't even know until, there were people in the area were suspicious of why there was all sorts of activity, like 100 miles northwest of Santa Fe. But Santa Fe was a relatively small city at that point. But they didn't really know what was going on until after they announced that's where they built the thing. So now, oddly enough, like the KGB agents knew, because there were actually there was a museum there. There were actual KGB spies and all sorts of spies there. They knew, but there was a sort of collusion on the top. It's not like the Russians would have announced this, because they didn't want to be. No, they didn't want to tell their populace that they were behind in the arms race or anything like that. So there is a kind of collusion from the top here. So in that regard, I do think the internet makes it harder for people to hide things than it is in the past. I mean, this goes back to, I think, we had an episode on, is surveillance. Are we all part of the NSA? Like, there was some commenter on Tyler Cowen's Marginal Evolution, who basically, again, you could argue this is playing devil's advocate, but like, did Hillary Clinton have a right to privacy regarding her emails? Like, well, we don't have the government clearly will read our emails, even if we have Proton and all, like the FBI and so forth, the GHQ, whatever, whatever the MI5, whatever the program there is, in England. But so like, do we have a right to quote unquote privacy? I mean, the cops dislike being filmed, but as pointed out, there's cameras all over places that cops watch all the time. So I mean, license plate scanners and so forth. So I know there's a techno dystopian line that could be enabled here, but I do think the ability to film things, and I do. But then again, people can fake film footage here. Maybe we're not. Maybe it's not like a Mission Impossible style fake yet. Although I don't know. Where you can sort of like live fake a whole person. Um, but maybe that's not there yet. But so that might throw a monkey wrench into the program here. But I do think people, if they want to, can be more aware of things. Like I don't think we can have a war like even during COVID. For as bad as the propaganda was, I mean, plenty of people didn't follow it. Enough people didn't follow it, and a lot of people who did follow it followed it hypocritically or half-heartedly. Which again, as Brian Kaplan said, when the philosophy is wrong, like you should almost cheer for hypocrisy. You should be glad Boris Johnson is having a party. Again, you should be annoyed that Boris Johnson is having decrees to not have parties. But if you're being hypocritical, but this is something that I don't know if 100 years ago would be found out as quickly, just by virtue of like, no, why would a politician would be having a party? I need evidence. Show me the evidence. Well, you have a film footage of it. You have a film footage of the governor of California at a winery having dinner during COVID lockdowns. You can actually, or Nancy Pelosi. You can actually show people, look, here it is, the evidence. Or if you have a film footage of a grainy film footage of, or no film footage of the Pentagon being struck on 2001, you have more evidence to show people. So even there, I mean, I don't know, like 9/11, even like if the conspirators are right, 9/11 could not happen today because there's too many cameras. Because people would find all the little loose change, so to speak. It's harder to document that. Again, AI faking could make this a problem, and the government can always use AI faking. But I have mild techno optimism. But go back to my first point. What do you do with that information? Even on COVID skepticism stuff, like I can choose to go travel or choose to go out to dinner or choose to hang out with friends because I know that it's either out of my control. Like I'm either gonna die, I'm probably not gonna die from COVID. But like, what can I do? Like Jeffrey Tucker has still been on the COVID beat, and he's bringing up all this dirt on all these politicians that got involved in this stuff. And it's like, well, I mean, we're not going to have a COVID Nuremberg trials. Sorry, Jeffrey Tucker. I mean, politicians, I mean, this is why I'm an anarchist. Politicians are never really held to justice. Or if they are, they're held for bizarre things like paying off porn stars for business transactions. I mean, that's, again, like, like as Chris Cachone would point out, lots of people lie on their taxes, including plenty of middle class people. Like that's basically what they're going after Trump. It's like if you claim the wrong number of deductions or something like that, or claim something as a business expense, which was actually a personal expense. That's like, like really. I mean, he's not being prosecuted for, doing Operation Warp Speed or something like that, or bombing Syria. So like, then that goes like, what can you actually do about it? And if you're skeptical of voting, the news is like, what can you actually? I mean, it just begs the question of like, why follow the news? So it goes back to our voting episode. Is voting a waste of time? I used to read the news more back when I was like in college and there, but then again, I was more of a centrist person then, so I believed it mattered to read the news. Now I follow sports. I follow sports more than I follow the news. So maybe that makes me. Maybe that I because I think sports, at least if the team wins, I'm happy about that. I mean, I obviously don't control the outcome of the game, but in that regard, I don't also control the outcome of there. So maybe news is useful for self-defense, but outside of self-defense, unless you want to go full Julian Assange martyr mode, like I don't really know what you can do. But even with Julian Assange stuff, like what has come about from all the war logs, like we know, like that's a great example. Like we know all these politicians were lying 20 years later. With Vietnam, it took a little longer. So maybe maybe I would end with slight techno optimism. Swithin, that's my last comment.
Um, yeah, I don't know. It just seems to me that there's a lot of people who treat the news as entertainment, and that's essentially what it is. And I think that's particularly if it was just kind of like light entertainment, it wouldn't be much of a problem. But I do think the fact that you have quote unquote democratic society, and people are supposed to care about the politics and stuff, then it becomes more of a problem, because then it gets tribal, um, and yeah, you don't necessarily find out the useful things that you need to know when you need to know them. So it can, like, politics taints news, because if you didn't have politics, then I think the news would be a lot better. Although to what extent can politics be abolished is another question. But yeah, I have mild optimism with technology. Obviously, deep fakes and stuff can be a problem, but at least you can cross-reference things and come to at least map the terrain of what are likely interpretations of things much more quickly than you had done historically. But yeah, whether there's a market for truth, I think there is. Is it that big? I'm not sure, and I think it's pretty hard to monetize. But I'd now like to thank everyone for listening. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.